My name's Cara. There's so much in a name. I was born Cara Vassar. After I married, I became Cara Deyerin. Now I know my birth name should have been Cara Rubinstein. A year and a half ago, I discovered I'm an NPE. And when people ask me what MPE stands for, I tell them, not parent expected. And then I always add, it's complicated, because it is. NPE is a term used by genealogists who would write non-paternal event next to people in a family tree they thought had a different father other than the one listed in the tree. We now use NPE or MPE, which stands for misattributed parentage event, to include people who discover that either of their parents aren't who they expected them to be. Now you're probably thinking, how does this happen? Maybe you're conjuring the milkman or the mailman. And while someone's mother having an affair is a common reason, there are other explanations. A person could be conceived through assistance, adopted, the result of a tryst, or even an assault, or perhaps a grandparent is raising their grandchild as their own. Remember, assisted conception doesn't just mean sperm, there are egg donors as well. Regardless of how we come into being in this world, every person with an MPE has a story to tell. And here's mine. I was born in Seattle to a single mom. My dad, who'd cleaned himself up briefly, relapsed into heroin use and left my mom just 2 months after they were married. They divorced before I was 1, and my mom's parents were murdered when I was 4, but that's definitely a different story. So it was pretty much just mom and me while I was growing up. When I was around 7, my mom wanted to take a break from being a single parent and visit a friend in San Francisco. She told me I'd be staying with my grandparents, and I wondered who she meant. She said, "Oh, your dad's parents, Pop and Eva," like I should know who they were. She then proceeded to put me on a bus in Bellevue, a small town outside of Seattle, small then, with a large red suitcase, and told me to get off in downtown Seattle in front of a floral shop across the street from a big department store called the Bon, which of course isn't there anymore. She did tell the bus driver these instructions too, and I was to look for a big black man in a red car. This was a terrifying experience for me. But this is my first memory of my introduction to the other side of my family, my dad's family. The first week I stayed with my grandparents was a big adjustment. Everyone spoke differently, and the food they ate was strange. They were loud and constantly teased each other, and I take everything literally. Plus, I did not look like anyone there. Eventually, I learned to mimic the speech patterns and body language of whichever group I found myself in, either my dad's family or my mom's family. But there were a few bumps along the way, like the time that my mom made me write "I will not say ain't" 1,000 times after I spend the weekend at Pop's and use the word like 1,000,000 times. But one thing was true, no matter where I went, I had to fit in. And I had to fight to do this. I had to fight for who I was. My mom's family wasn't too pleased she'd married a black man, and Pop once told me black folks had to accept anyone who had a drop of black blood because white folks wouldn't. So that's why he said the family accepted me. But you see, they really didn't. My cousins once used my grandma Eva's face makeup to paint me black so I'd look like them. I had a rash for a week. And while Eva was a kind, gentle woman, she did treat me differently than her other grandkids. Pop told me it was because I looked white and she didn't like white folks due to a near-death experience of racism she'd had in Oklahoma when she was young. It didn't really matter why to a young child. The pain of being singled out and treated differently was always there. When my mom and I moved to Seattle from Bellevue in the 5th grade, she changed my race to black. At the time, you had to choose only one race on those school forms. She figured being black might help me with more benefits in the school system. In the first week, the school secretary called me to the office and told me, after looking at me, that she was changing me back to white. I told her she'd better not, that my uncle, yes, I'm talking about my dad's brother, was president of the school board and she'd have to answer to him. Needless to say, she left me as black. I'm proud of my biracial heritage. When people would ask me of my ethnicity, I would say yes, and they usually thought I was Greek, Middle Eastern, or maybe Hispanic. When I told them I was half black, they were incredulous. "There's no way," they usually responded. People don't really understand how hurtful this is. Here I was telling them I was half black, and they were discounting who I was. they were discounting me. The worst part was, after the comment, they'd pause and look at me funny and say, "Oh, I hope I've never said anything offensive." And I'd say, "You just did." Sometimes I'd even have to show them a picture of my dad in order for them to believe me. Even then, I could still see the doubt painted on their face. Funny thing is, it's a doubt I never shared. It's difficult to see others question who you are so openly. I'd also get comments from folks with skin that's darker than mine. They'd tell me I could never really understand what it means to be black because the color of my skin meant I could skate through life entitled like everyone else with my complexion. But I did grow up hearing the stories of racism my family experienced throughout our collective history. Stories of a refusal of a place to get warm due to the color of my grandmother's skin, or of the police stopping my cousins for no reason. I'd hear about how people would stop my dad and question who he was when he took my young, blonde-haired, blue-eyed children to the mall. These stories were woven into who I am. And while I've had to do a lot of defending my biracial status with people of every color, I've also faced the prevalent racism in our society, either because someone knew I was half black or because I do have a slightly swarthy complexion. Once a girl in elementary school asked if I was black, and I said, "Yeah?" And she slapped me across the face. I was too stunned to react. I've been called Oreo, zebra, half-calf. I've been spat on. And then, of course, there are the little remarks people make daily that mean no harm, but are like little mosquito bites, stinging just a little bit every time. Probably because I had to fight for my identity, family, and heritage have always been important to me. It might also be because I've never had the big family or community I've deeply desired. There's a yearning in my core for this kind of connection I could never explain. I think this is why I've always been fascinated by genealogy. I'm the keeper of my mom's family's genealogy book, you know, the kind before the internet, and my dad's family's research showing they're descended from 3 slave brothers who were sold in Texas. I've always wondered where in Africa those brothers came from. So for Christmas in 2017, I purchased DNA kits for my dad and myself to find out where our African roots are. It was just 2 days before my 44th birthday in January 2018 when I received my results. When I saw the link that my test results were ready, I was so excited. As soon as I saw my results, though, I knew instantly something was wrong. It's difficult to describe to someone what this feels like who's never experienced such a thing. Although I do imagine if you've received other life-changing news, you'd have an idea about this. For me, my world stopped spinning. My mind froze. It was like I'd been punched in the gut. I curled into a tight ball, immobilized for quite some time, numb to the world around me. I think for anyone who's had an MPE, it's one of those events you always know when and where you were when you found out, like when the shuttle exploded or when Kennedy was shot. Me, I'd just woken up and was in bed checking my email. I clicked on the link and read my ethnic makeup. It said I didn't have any African DNA, not even 1%. Instead, it said I was 50% Ashkenazi Jew. I thought, my mom's not Jewish. She doesn't even know anybody who's Jewish. And of course, now I know she did, at least for a little bit. And I knew my dad certainly wasn't Jewish. How can this be, I thought? And then it hit me. There's really only one way. I was sure, of course, there must have been a mistake, but we all know DNA doesn't lie. Still, I ordered another test from another DNA company, just to be sure. I thought perhaps they'd switch my results, but then I noticed I had a lot of matches connected to my mother's side of the family. I called my mom, and I'm grateful she didn't say it wasn't impossible. Or it wasn't possible, as I've learned many mothers do when they're faced with this question. What she did say was she was surprised too. She told me that after my father left her, she did have a one-night stand with a man she'd met in a bar in Aurora, but she generally never thought a pregnancy resulted. A number of weeks later, Dad came back to get the rest of his stuff from their apartment, and they had one last hurrah, and that's when she thought I was created. She'd always thought I was born early, which explained the timeline. Now, I knew my dad would be getting his DNA results soon, and I didn't want him to learn this news from a computer, so I went to tell him in person. My dad had eventually kicked his heroin habit in my teens. In my late 20s, we worked hard to build a relationship, and sometime in my 30s, I felt comfortable calling him Dad. Telling him he wasn't my biological father was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. But he hugged me tight and told me it didn't change anything. He told me I have a right to know who my biological father is and what my genetic and cultural history are. And I agree with him. I firmly believe it's a human right to know your biological and cultural history. So, to that end, I splattered the internet with my DNA trying to find my biological father. And while I did have about 12,000 cousin matches, welcome to being Jewish, none of them were close enough for me to figure out who my biological father could be. I felt like crying all the time. My foundation was toppled. I was raised biracial, and in a flash, a click of a mouse, I wasn't. This was an integral part of who I was. Suddenly not knowing anything about half of yourself is mind-boggling and numbing. Every time I'd look in the mirror, I'd question who I was. I would look at myself and I would wonder which traits I had inherited. Did I look like this stranger I knew nothing about? I'd check the DNA websites many times a day, hoping for a new match. For 4 months, I lived in this hellish limbo. Luckily, a possible second cousin match popped up in late spring. I immediately reached out to him, but he didn't respond. In hindsight, I should have Googled who he was. I would have likely taken a slightly different approach. And for all of you out there who have an MPE, I'd suggest you do a quick Google search on who you're reaching out to before you do. But, not being a gal who likes to wait, I decided to build my new paternal cousin a family tree. I knew that we shared at least the same great-grandparents and possibly the same grandparents. After a couple weeks of researching genealogy documents, reading obituaries, and calling possible relatives, I found a man who fit the timeline, and when I saw a picture of him on the internet, I just knew. I looked just like him, which is very weird for a person who's never looked like anyone other than her mother. I reached out to this man, sending him a snail mail letter, suggesting he might be my biological father. He did call me back, ironically the day after Father's Day, but he told me he was ill and he was losing his memory and couldn't help me. I'm lucky though, because after speaking with more family members and having a few more DNA matches appear, I was able to figure out who my biological father was. The second cousin match, who chose not to respond to me, but led me to find out who my biological father was, turned out to be my first cousin once removed. His mother is my only living paternal first cousin, but the family does not wish to have contact with me. The man who was ill turned out to be my half-brother. Unfortunately, he was an only child. It saddens me more than words can explain, his unwillingness to share medical and family history. The similarities we share, at least that I can find on the internet, are striking. And not having family medical history leaves my children and me in the dark about possible medical issues. Unfortunately, my brother passed away in May this year, and I'm grateful I was able to quietly attend the funeral. I spent a few weeks agonizing over whether I should attend since the family does not wish contact. I didn't want to miss the opportunity to learn about my brother and honor him. I knew it might be my only chance to hear stories of him. And when I finally decided to go, just a few days before, I was able to slip in and slip out without any fuss, and I'm really happy I did decide to attend. My biological father was Sam Rubinstein. He was a prominent businessman and philanthropist in Seattle who did die in 2007. I will never know the man who is my biological father. My first cousin's family, who doesn't wish contact with me, told me I could read about Sam and find pictures of him in archived newspaper articles. And while I did read all 500 plus mentions of him, this doesn't really paint a full picture of Sam. Plus, the actual photographs are pretty grainy. For me, his prominence is a double-edged sword. I've often lamented how I wish he would have been the local electrician down the road, because I believe his prominence limits people's desire to speak with me. However, from the articles I've read and the bits and pieces I've been able to piece together about his major life events and family history, I've learned my grandfather Carl Rubinstein started out peddling vegetables from a cart and horse. I have to say, my heart aches for anyone who has a misattributed parentage experience who's also been rejected by their biological family. We have no access to information about our fathers, and I guess that's why I'm lucky my father was prominent. I do get to see information about him. All we want to know as MPEs is who we are, where we came from, who we look like. But based on what I've learned about Sam and the few people who have agreed to talk to me about him, I do know my entrepreneurial spirit, my strong personal drive, and resiliency come from him, although the latter probably comes from both sides. I've been told my eyes are exactly like his, but I do have so many questions about my biological father that are likely never going to be answered. How tall was he? I'm short, but my boys are really tall. Could he sing? I can't. Did he need lots of sleep? I don't. What was his favorite food? Did he like to read? I showed my mom a picture of Sam, but she still couldn't remember anything. I mentioned how odd it was for her to meet this man, this prominent man, at a bar on Aurora, which was a seedy neighborhood at the time. And she said, "Oh, it wasn't a bar, it was a restaurant." I was 18 years old and only bars and restaurants would serve me alcohol. It was the Canless restaurant. It was close to my apartment. Well, it turns out Sam's condo was near the Canless too. I've been told he ate there about once a week. And now I'm grateful I have a starting point for my story. I often have to remind myself of my new identity and who my family is because they too have contributed to who I am today. I've developed a mantra Katniss Everdeen style. A doctor in The Mockingjay told Katniss to use this technique when everything she's known is gone. She starts with the simplest things she knows to be true and works towards the more complex. Katniss starts with her name, and I think it's a perfect place for me to start too, like I did with this chat. As I mentioned, and there's so much in a name. So, I am Kara Joanne Rubinstein Deyerin. My father was the Salmon King, Sam Rubinstein. My aunt was Rose Jacobs. I had a half-brother who was an economics professor. My cousin was Helena Rubinstein, the makeup queen. I am half Jewish. I find myself repeating this at least once a day to give me a foothold in my new reality. And while I haven't taken to hiding in tunnels yet, like Katniss, I still have hard days. It's surreal when part of who you've known as you is taken away from you. I continue to struggle with the concept of identity and who I am now and coming to terms with not being biracial anymore. I recently had to fill out one of those forms again that asked my race. I really just couldn't do it. I could not check a simple box. It didn't feel correct or right to check white, and I felt like I'd be lying or a fake to say I was mixed or black. But our identity is developed by the stories, family traditions, and experiences we're immersed in growing up. It's these things combined with our genetics that make up the fabric of who we are, and I know part of who I was now based on a lie. I'm having to recreate that fabric. Since my discovery, a common response is, "I knew you weren't half black." This innocent reply reminds me of how much I've had to prove my identity in the past. Every time I hear it, it rekindles the sadness, the sense of loss I feel over losing half of my identity. When I tell people Sam Rubinstein is my father, I now find myself having to prove the fact that I'm a Rubinstein. And I really hope one day I will no longer have to defend who I am. In trying to rebuild my story, I went to temple for the first time after the shootings in Pittsburgh. And one thing struck me. I look a lot like the people in the room. This was a first for me. Most of my life, I just wanted to walk into a room and feel like I belonged, like I looked like I should be there. That night, I felt this for the first time. Because my paternal family isn't interested in contact, I'm learning about my newly discovered Jewish heritage on my own. To help me make sense of my Jewish identity, I've started a blog, Unexpectedly Jewish in Seattle. Some say being an MPE changes nothing, that you're the same, but they're missing the point. A discovery like this forever changes how you see yourself. It can't help but to. It shatters your identity, and while you can pick up the pieces, it is impossible to put them back together in the same way. So yes, I'm still me, but a different me.